Welcome back to the channel, and this week's reptile episode is all about the slow worm and how to keep these endearing, beautiful little lizards often found in the English countryside. So for the last few years, my slow worms have been kept in a large, I'm going to say, at least 2 meter diameter outdoor enclosure, fashioned from a old cattle drinking trough and designed in such a way that they can't escape, of course. There's a guy over there right now. I'm going to come back in a bit when the sun's out. Often they do come out to bask, but I'll tell you more about that later on. Look at that. So, in an outdoor enclosure, you can use artificial stuff, but I think a bit of bark looks better. There's a large compost area under there that gets topped up regularly. Literally compost heap compost, which really means there's a place, a damp spot especially, but a place for invertebrates to live, their food. I do vary this, but you've got ground cover, but there's open areas, but there's still ground cover here to make them feel safe. This polystyrene box here, you can just see the corners of it. That's part of a large hibernaculum, and down there is the entrance, or a entrance. And the central area here is also a hibernaculum with lots of wood and twigs on top, buried in soil, and that there gives them, in this enclosure, about a foot down of depth, because this doesn't go in the ground. I can't dig it beyond this, but it's got through an incredibly cold, snowy winter. This rock pile here leads into that hibernaculum. Now there's other animals in here. Originally there were pool frogs, which there still are. I'll show you those later. So there's a large pond area made from a plastic stack and store box, about 6 or 8 inches deep, about 8 inches deep. It's never cleaned out apart from excess weed removed. And think about your planting. Now, just like a garden, it takes a while to grow, but low cover. We don't want lots of high cover in here, and these all have to be kept down because, of course, the inhabitants could crawl up and escape. But plants like thyme that flowers well, and even this comfrey, if you can keep it low enough, those flowers and those plants don't just provide cover for the slow worms and the invertebrates in there, they bring in insect life. So this is my current slow worm setup. Key things: hibernaculum, get deep down into the soil to hibernate, cover, bit of ground cover but open areas, a composty area that you can keep topping up. Under cover you can use plastic sheet, old carpet tiles, but in something like this you want it to look natural. Big sheets of bark work really well for sure. And the water source, slow worms can swim as long as they can crawl up and get out the plants or rocks at the side, no problem there. Feeding something like this, so in here, going back, we've got pool frogs, we had young green toads, marbled newts, spadefoot toads, slow worms and common lizards. There's all the pool frogs are there, and some of the slow worms are there, because what happened when I moved them out here, the first or second winter, something got in. Here's a tip: you need to use, at the minimum, I think, 1 inch by ½ inch metal mesh to be on the safe side. Something maybe you can take off while you're looking at the animals, maybe a cover that you can lift off. I put this on to stop the local jackdaws getting in and eating my slow worms, and I'll tell you why this 40mm mesh is a fail. Number one, something got in the winter and ate most of my slow worms and common lizards that year. Whether it was a rat or a weasel, I don't know. The ones that survived were very badly chewed and wounded in the spring when they came out, but they've been okay since. Another problem with this bigger mesh, I weekly supplement feed these slow worms with worms, wax worms, mealworms and crickets that I put in for the other animals. The local wrens and robins have really worked that out. Even though it's only once a week, they can fit in. They literally, when I turn my back after heavily feeding once a week, even though I scatter feed the food everywhere, they go in and they fill their boots and steal the food for the slow worms. So you do need a mesh cover on an outdoor enclosure, and it does need to be able to stop all those predators and thieves actually getting in to eat your slow worms or steal their food. Think about that for sure. And think about where you site your outdoor enclosure. Think about where you site it. This is a shady woodland edge that I've got here. It gets early morning sun, and then it gets late afternoon and evening sun. But just like a woodland edge slowworm habitat, it's not in full sun all the time. If yours is, that's perfectly fine. Provide those deep underground hiding areas, as well as plenty of low cover to keep the shade in there. They'll be just fine. This is really where I had an opportunity to site this, and it's working very well indeed. But I'll show you some other ways to keep these beautiful animals, that you can study them, keep them, enjoy them, and propagate them. So what is a slow worm? Well, I'd like to think you know by now it's a lizard that doesn't have legs. That does not make it a snake. We don't need to get a scalpel out and dissect it. We can see it can blink. It has movable eyelids. No snake has that. Turn it upside down, find its vent, its cloaca, that one hole that does everything, and you'll see that a slow one with a full tail, its tail is way longer than its body, like many small lizards. If you look at a snake, its tail is only a short part of it. The rest of it is body. Even snakes with long tails that live in trees and they use them as prehensile tails to wrap around, their tail is only a small part of their total length. Most of the snake is body. It has a smallish tail. Slow worms, like many small lizards, have a really long tail unless it's been broken off. And that brings us to another thing. Like many small lizards, if they get attacked or frightened, it doesn't have to be pulled off. They can drop off on purpose, portion of their tail, and for 5 or 6 minutes it'll wriggle around like a wriggly worm, diverting the attention of the bird that's attacking it, or the hedgehog, or whatever's attacking it. The slow worm can wriggle away, or the predator can't resist that really lively wiggly tail. The slow worm won't regenerate another long tail like some lizards. It'll sort of regenerate a stump, often called stumpies. Those big old slow worms with hardly any tail left at all. They've used it up like little bits of extra lives. In the wild, they love to eat small slugs, they love to eat worms, they love to eat things that they find where they live. Millipedes, you'll often find them in amongst ant nests. Those shiny, tightly packed scales, the ants have got nothing to purchase, and there's those lovely big juicy ant grubs all around them. Just the right sort of food for a slow worm. I'd say slugs and worms are their favourite, but they really do eat all kinds of relatively soft-bodied mini beasts, invertebrates and insects. They're not that fussy, and they'll take what's going for sure. Male slow worms can get a big one, nearly as thick as my thumb. A really big old male, often have blue spots down his side, looking gorgeous. In captivity, I think the record is 51 years old. These are long-lived animals in the wild and in captivity, if they can evade predation in the wild. And they tend to be found where I live. It's a woodland edge animal. Those sunny areas in broken woodland or on the edge of woodland. They love grassy places, perfect for their food, and they love to hide under things. They're a semi-fossorial animal. They spend quite a bit of time in the ground and under rocks and things like that. And they'll often bask under something that heats up in the sun, so they're not exposed to the danger of birds above, but they're still getting that sun's heat. They'll survive in captivity at house temperature forever, but they certainly do, as we'll discuss further, they do like a basking spot and benefit, I think, from that, getting that metabolism up. In the wild, they're so variable in their colour. I'm going to be really basic and tell you that the babies are born almost golden with a thin pinstripe down their back, but as they mature, the males tend to turn greyish colour. They lose generally the pinstripe, and generally the females are more golden with the pinstripe and black sides and a black tummy. The length of them varies enormously because obviously an average size slow worm with its complete tail, it's quite a long animal. I don't know, wow, 18 inches long. But a slow worm older that's twice as fat, that's lost 2/3 of its tail, could be quite a short animal, maybe just a foot long, but incredibly thick, set and stumpy. They're a lizard with a lizard's head and a lizard's face. They track the things like slugs with their tongue, following the scent trail, the slime trail of the slug, tracking it down. Yes, they've got teeth. Yes, they've got strong jaws. Will they bite you? No, they won't bite you. I think I've been nipped on once or twice ever by a slow worm. They are beautiful animals, but from our British point of view, they're one of our most endearing little reptiles. They really are sweet. And yet people still go, oh, it's a worm. It's not slow. Is it? Yeah, it is quite slow, but it's not a worm, and it's certainly not a snake. Wonderful, wonderful creatures. If you don't keep things in captivity, you don't study them in captivity, Go and see them in the wild. See if you can find them. Enjoy them in the wild. It is an animal you can get close to. They're quite photogenic. They're easily handled. As long as you're gentle and don't startle them, or they're going to lose a bit of their tail. Holding a slow worm, letting your children hold a wild slow worm, is not going to stress it out and cause it to have a nervous breakdown. And the minute it's put back where it came from, life will return to complete normality without it having to see a counsellor to get its head straight. Encourage your kids to pick up these things and study them, not to not touch them for the poor animal's sake. Gentle and kind, put it back where you found it. If you're flipping rocks to look for them, put the rocks back down. Encourage those kids to make that connection. Massively important, not just for us grown-up kids, for the real kids for sure. Enjoy this video, enjoy a bit about learning about them, and if you do keep them well and enjoy them. So another way to keep them is actually wild and free in your garden. If you leave some of your garden to grow up, they love long grass. That's where they find a lot of their favourite prey, the small slugs. Let patches of your garden grow up like this, in a sunny spot in your garden, not in the deep shade. It's a reptile, it wants some sunshine. Allow patches of your garden to grow up, and critically and most importantly, have a compost heap. Have a compost heap and cover it with black tarpaulin or just the odd carpet tile or a bit of corrugated bitumen roofing. Something black especially absorbs the sun. Put that on top, it keeps the moisture in, it keeps all the worms, the millipedes, even the ants and their larvae, all up near the surface of the compost heap. Now remember, a slowworm is a fossorial animal, semi-fossorial. That means it lives underground and amongst the ground quite a lot of its life. Rough patches like this, giving it security, some open areas, as many plants and butterfly and insect plants as you want to put in your garden. All those invertebrates come. Weedy, grassy places in your garden with a compost heap. Honestly, the compost heap is where they're going to live, breed and find most of their food. Again, situate that in the sunshine, not in the deep shade. A garden pond is the best thing for all wildlife in your garden, and for sure your slow worms, like most things, will benefit from a pond if they're not drinking directly themselves, which they do sometimes. All the little slugs and the invertebrates that like that damp area will be found around that wildlife pond. Guys, you can easily get a population of slow worms going in your garden if you provide them some habitat. It doesn't need to be large, but be aware. Of course, things like crows and jackdaws eat them, but in an urban environment, by far and away, the biggest destroyer of your slow worms will be your cat or next door's cat. My population of slow worms, most of them came to me 13 years ago from a guy that had oodles of slow worms in his garden in Milton Keynes of all places, in a total urban garden. He left lots of areas for the slow worms, put lots of little bits of black tarpaulin down and asphalt, roofing felt, patches everywhere, loads of scattered areas for them to hide under. And after 35 years of living in that house and having a huge population of slow worms that naturally turned up there, his wife got a cat. Carnage. Slow worms' tails, dead slow worms brought into the house, absolutely everywhere. It broke his heart so much that he called in some ecologists and said, can you catch up all my slow worms and take them to somewhere, a wild, better habitat? And he gave me some for my school education. The cat is an absolute nightmare for slow worms in suburbia, but you for sure can cultivate them and keep them in your garden free. And of course, the other way to keep slow worms is indoors in vivaria. You can keep them in ordinary with, sliding glass doors, wooden vivariums. Two things there. They do like a little bit of moisture, a little bit of dampness, which can blow the wood of the woodwork of the vivarium. And if they do breed, those little live babies can squeeze between the glass panes and cause a problem because they'll escape. The best thing, I do keep some in a vivarium at work to show people, just a couple, but the best thing is an old fish tank. Now, if it's higher than the slow worms are long, you don't need to worry too much about a lid. But if it's not, it needs a tight fitting, probably mesh lid. They'll go at the corners of the vivarium, the tank, and if they've got their full tails, those slow worms have got their entire intact tails, a little point on the end of their tails, and they'll use that to almost stand upon and push up right up the side of the glass, and they'll get out the gap in the corners. They'll get out, believe me, if they can. An aquarium is better. It's better because you can have a damper substrate and that kind of thing. I think that's my preferred way. This is how easy you can lay out that indoor vivaria. Put in a sandy soil mix, a bit of potting compost, cheap potting compost mixed with some sand and some soil. Quite a light sandy sort of substrate. I use a food dish, and if you go to somewhere like a reptile shop, you can get little dishes that mealworms struggle to get out of. Pop one of them in there. Pop a water bowl in there. They will drink a little bit, but they also like to be sprayed with a mister occasionally. And this is the sort of thing they like to hide under. Little bits of slate, little bits of old clay pot or clay pipe. And a simple thing, if you've got the space in your garden, I just dig up with a trowel a small chunk of turf. I'll put that in one corner of the vivarium. You can spray that down for them to drink off the droplets. It's a little moist area, and they'll go underneath that little bit of turf. And once it dries out or dies off and the grass goes leggy, put it back where it came from and get another bit. That's what I do. So you can quite simple, sandy soil mixture, if you can a little bit of turf and some little flat rocks and things to hide under. You can put plastic plants and bushier things in there and they will climb around. Do they need lighting? No. They're a pretty fossorial animal, and like a lot of fossorial lizards, like a lot of skinks and things, they'll thrive for decades without any particular lighting or any particular heat other than your house temperature. Is that the best way to keep them? Probably not. I find if you put in a very small localized spot bulb, a little small heat bulb over a bit of flat slate or something, they'll regularly use that to bask under. Keep it localized. Don't heat the whole thing up to tropical temperatures. They're a temperate animal, but a small warm basking spot they definitely utilize. They look nicer under a spectrum fluorescent lighting or LED lighting with a UV wavelength. If you want to be really posh, get them a relatively low level reptile lighting with ultraviolet rays in there. Do they need it? No, they don't. Will it shorten their life? I don't think so. The record is, I think, 51 years in captivity. If you let them get a bit of natural light in a room, always bear in mind anything in the glass tank with the sun coming through the glass of the window as well can really magnify that heat and overheat them. So bear that in mind for sure. But an indoor setup, an old aquarium, an old tank style vivarium, or more traditional wooden with the sliding doors will work. But remember, they have live young which are very, very thin, very, very short, and can get out of tiny gaps. A big male will eat the young. I've not seen it happen, but I've kind of witnessed them vanish for no other reason. They are very well housed communally, but when they're breeding, they will be quite brutal. A big male will very often grab a female round the neck. It will leave little wounds, they'll be fine. Grab her around the neck, a bit like ferrets breeding, and forcibly mate with her. That's normal. It's not trying to eat your females. And that'll be triggered by the longer days and the warmer spring weather. Wherever they're being kept, it might be slightly different, but they'll breed in the spring. And later in the summer, they'll have those live babies, as long as they're kept well fed. Take the babies out, rear them separately in a smaller container, a smaller vivarium, a smaller fish tank, a smaller setup. If you can, if you're keeping them indoors, it will be much easier to keep that little bit of dampness in the soil and feed them plenty of small chopworms and tiny waxworms and things like that. So that brings me to feeding your slow worms. Keeping them outdoors, nature will feed them. Good compost heap, plenty of wild places, nature will feed them. In my outdoor open top setup with plants and flowers and thyme and heather, insects come in naturally. Slugs and snails will breed in there. Don't forget there's a bit of compost regularly put in there under that wood in that outdoor enclosure. Indoors, without a doubt, they love small worms. They love them, and they'll soon come out at feeding time and get used to you feeding them. They love small slugs. Now, I don't feed slugs and snails harvested from the wild to my tropical animals that eat them. Slugs are notorious for being an intermediate host for parasites. Listen, that's what slowworms eat in the wild. I've never had a problem feeding slowworms as many small slugs as I can find. They love them. But going back to a little mealworm pot, your little escape-proof mealworm pot, little dish that you buy in a reptile shop. Small mealworms, we're talking live mealworms, not the dried stuff. Small mealworms, they'll eat them no problem. Waxworms, they'll eat them no problem. So you've got that supplementary food that you can always have on hand. You can always get mealworms, you can always get waxworms. Yes, they do eat them, no problem. I've had slowworms live on nothing else for several months at a time. they will eat them just fine. But worms, you can dig them in your garden. Small slugs, you can find them under damp places in your garden or in the woods. Go and get a pot full of the little tiny white and grey slugs. They love them. Easy to feed. Just put the food in or put it in a dish. Water bowl, they'll drink, and you can spray them now and again. Bit of droplets to drink. They really are incredibly easy things to keep, as long as you don't cook them, overheat them, or let them get away, and then who knows what's going to happen to them in your house. Again, outdoors, your biggest problem if you're keeping them in the garden, you get a population growing. Cats are just a nightmare for slow worms. They really, really are. Outdoor enclosure, your problem is birds getting in to eat the food. Finer mesh than I'm using, or birds getting in, or rats getting in, or weasels getting in to eat your slow worms, especially when they're hibernating in the winter. Mesh that top when you're not around, for sure. Where are you going to get your slow worms from? People are now captive breeding them. Get on some of the social media pages that deal with UK and European reptiles and amphibians. Try and find out who's captive breeding them. In the UK at the moment, 2023, perfectly legal to take your slow worms from the wild. They're a protected species. They've got no protection against you taking them from the wild and keeping them as pets. Totally legal, no problem at all. But do you want to be pillaging the wild to get your slow worms? That needs to be your last resort. People that go, oh, wild take's terrible. Listen, every single reptile amphibian we keep, its ancestors were taken from the wild, for sure, but there's better ways, aren't there? There's a step back from the wild, and that is if you can find someone that already has a massive healthy population in their garden. When they lift up tarpaulin or bits of felt on their compost heaps, there's a dozen or 20 slow worms under there. See if they'll let you have a couple of pairs, that you can set up your own little breeding colony. So yes, they kind of are wild, but it's slightly different, I think, from taking them from the wild woods. But if you can, try and source some captive bred slow worms. They're small, they need small food. They'll eat white worms, but they perfectly well eat small, chopped up small earthworms. Get them feeding yourself. See if you can grow them on yourself from captive bred. That would be the perfect and the ideal for sure. Of course, you can still study slow worms without keeping them in any of the 3 ways mentioned, can't you? You can find out, do your research, be a naturalist. Where's the nearest place to your area where slow worms can be found? Go and look in the right places. Rocky sunny banks on the edge of woodland, heathland. Go and look, lift up stuff and go and look. Because the slow worm will usually bask under a warm rock or a warm bit of rubbish or a bit of roofing felt. But they do come out. I'll put a link up somewhere, I might put it here, a link to another video where you can see me filming slow worms in the wild that were naturally out basking. Normally they'll bask under cover, but they will come out and bask. And they'll certainly come out an awful lot as a pet, as an animal to study, as a captive animal. You'll see quite a lot of them. Every one of you that tunes into this channel, you're all absolutely brilliant. I love you loads. Tune into the next video.